the first measures to control and limit the use of pesticides and agrochemicals in agriculture date back to 2005. Regulation 396 of the European Commission on maximum residue levels of pesticides in food imposes on member states of the European Union the obligation to carry out controls to ensure that food placed on the market is compliant with the legal limits of pesticide residues. The regulation takes into consideration food produced in Europe as well as food imported from non-European countries. Member states are then requested to share the results of the official controls and other relevant information with the European Food Safety Authority. Based on these results, the Food Safety Authority prepares an annual report on pesticide residues, analyzing the data in terms of compliance and the exposure of European consumers to pesticide residues in their food. Among others, these data contain information about which pesticide residues were detected, on which food, in which country the food was produced, and in which country it was sampled. In 2009, new rules were introduced by the European Commission. According to Regulation 1107, pesticide substances that are hazardous for humans, animals, and the environment are banned from use in Europe. With Regulation 649 of 2012, exports and imports of hazardous substances are governed by the prior informed consent. All pesticides listed in the PIC are considered hazardous and they are either banned in the European Union or their use is severely restricted. Anyway, since 2009, the European Union has been committed not only to controlling the presence of pesticides and their related risks on consumers, but also to promoting their sustainable use. Directive 128, transposed by Legislative Decree number 150 of August 14, 2012, established a framework for community action to achieve the sustainable use of pesticides. For the implementation of this directive, national action plans have been defined to establish the objectives, measures, timeframes, and indicators for the reduction of risks and impacts arising from the use of plant protection products. The European Action Plan was then adopted in Italy with the Interministerial Decree of January 22, 2014, which promotes more sustainable practices in the use of plant protection products and provides indications to reduce the impact of these substances in agricultural areas, non-agricultural areas, for example, urban green areas, roads, railways, and so on, and protected natural areas. Italy has long since adopted a national action plan that aims to significantly reduce the risk associated with pesticides in order to protect human health and environment. Nevertheless, the amount of residues resulting from the use of agro-pharmaceutical and plant protection products in agriculture found in fruit, vegetables, and processed products remains worryingly high. So, which pesticides are normally used in agriculture? 48% are herbicides, 30% are insecticides, 18% are fungicides, and a minor percentage 7% are other types of pesticides. According to international estimates, Italy is one of the countries in the world with the highest concentration of pesticides per hectare of cultivated land. PAN's latest annual surveys on the contamination of chemical residues in food shows that 61% of the samples analyzed were regular and free of pesticide residues, 14.7% resulted to be regular with mono residues, 18.4% were regular but with multi residues, and only 1.3% of the food sampled were found to be non-compliant or illegal. This is a positive result, but it is not enough on its own to make us more aware of how many and which pesticide residues can be found in food and remain in the environment, because while on the one hand it is true that only 1.3% of food samples are non-compliant, on the other hand, it is equally true that almost 38% of these regular samples are in fact contaminated with one or more fungicide and insecticide residues. The true problem with pesticide residues in food is actually that by European legislation, food is not considered illegal if each single residue level does not exceed the maximum permitted limit, without regard to the sum of all substances that can be detected together. As in previous years, fruit is the category where the highest percentage of regular multi-residue samples is concentrated. Only 36% of the samples analyzed were free of pesticide residues, while 1.7% were irregular. But more than 60% of fruit, especially pears, peaches, and table grapes, despite being considered regular, had one or more chemical residues. Some strawberry samples, even of Italian origin, have up to 9 residues at the same time. The situation was similar for table grapes, which were found to have up to 6 residues. And papaya samples were all found to be irregular due to exceeding the maximum permitted limit of a fungicide, the most detected agrochemical substance in all fruit. As for vegetables, 64% of the samples were free of residues, but a significant percentage of irregularities was found in some products, such as 8% of peppers. The record is a pepper sample with 25 residues, 5% of stem vegetables, and more than 2% of pulses. In addition, some tomato samples from Sicily and Lazio had up to 6 residues simultaneously, that is, a high percentage of multi-residues, and one lettuce sample from Lazio had as many as 8. Common to most of the irregularities is the exceeding of maximum residue limits for fungicides. Referring to animal products, the most relevant aspect highlighted by the annual report is that 5% of Italian eggs are contaminated with insecticides. And in food imported from abroad, the percentage of chemical residues is even more evident. That means that the food which is most contaminated by chemical residues, especially pesticides, fungicides, and insecticides, comes from outside Europe, and especially from China. The most contaminated foods are 2 Chinese products, green tea and peppers, both with as many as 25 pesticide residues. Food from organic farming shows encouraging results. All samples analyzed were regular and free of residues. In other European countries, the situation is even more worrying than in Italy. The analysis of the presence of pesticides in European food is carried on in samples that include plant-based food, animal-based food, raw food, processed food, organic food, and baby food. Of the food products analyzed, 2% contained residues exceeding the legal maximum. 53% were found to be free of residues, but as many as 45%, that is almost half, contained one or more residues in concentrations just below or equal to the permitted limits. As expected, plant-based products are the ones most often found with pesticide residues. Over half, 53.9% of samples had residues of at least one pesticide, and over one-third, about 35%, had residues of two or more pesticides. Which means that almost 90% of all food is contaminated by pesticides. For European products, fruits, again, had the most pesticides, with 48.4% of one pesticide residue and more than a half with two or more pesticides. These worrying data show that all fruit in Europe is contaminated by pesticides. In a comparison between European and non-European food, the analysis of the presence of pesticides in food shows that food samples from non-European countries had a higher percentage of pesticide residues and pesticide mixtures than food from Europe. 61.5% of food from non-European countries had residues of one or more pesticides, and 43.2% had residues of mixture of pesticides. Again, the higher concentration of pesticides was found in fruit. 71.7% of imported fruit had pesticides and 55% had more than one. For European products, pesticides were most often detected in fruits. 67% of fruits produced in Europe had pesticides, and about half of the samples had residues of at least two or more pesticides. So it is now clear that the real problem related to the presence of agrochemical in food is actually the more frequent multi-residue, even though it has been known for years that exactly the addition and interaction of several different active ingredients can cause extremely harmful effects on human organism. It is not so much the individual residues, but rather the sum of the various residues added together that through inhalation, ingestion, exposure, or contact collectively have harmful effects on human health. According to recent studies and research, pesticides can affect not only the health of farmers while at work. The effects on human health are also evident in consumers, because of ingestion of food contaminated by mono or multi-residue agrochemical, which can cause cardiac failure, lung cancer, hepatic necrosis, ovarian cancer, and musculoskeletal diseases as well.